Hello and welcome to the Sexient Being Sessions. Today we're talking about my own best Dom. And in this instance, it is mainly aimed at subs, but can be applied for Doms as well. The idea here is being your own best leader in life because you are the top person who knows what is best for you, what it's like to have been with you through every single experience from the time you're born until the time you die. No one else is there with you for that ride except for you. So you are the only person who can ultimately make those best choices for you. I'm Alix Pruett, a certified sex, love, and relationship coach with a BDSM and kink focus. I work with men, women, and couples plus who want to transform their old patterns, pain, and beliefs so they can create thriving relationships that are deeply connected, playful, and fulfilling within themselves and with others. So there are a few concepts here that I have come across in my own journey of my sexuality and personal identities, along with um, just healing and finding fulfilling relationships in general. And this comes back to this concept of being my own best Dom. And for a long time, I didn't think about ever needing to be a leader in my own life. And especially when it came to the idea of being submissive, when it came to my sexuality, it was easier to just let other people choose. And that meant I ended up having some experiences that I really enjoyed. It also meant I had other ones that were not necessarily my cup of tea, or that I actually fell into some old people pleasing patterns that I didn't consciously know existed within my being, where I would end up saying yes to situations that really carried a no for me because a lot of the time I was invalidating my own experience or what my needs were. This led to a lot of high codependency in relationships. And when it came down to, again, this concept of being my own best Dom, that taught me to take this leadership role and really led me on this path to finding what that truly means for me. And hopefully you can find some value here. So let's dive in. The first thing I find as a high value character of being a Dom, of being this great leader, of being your own best guide or mentor or coach is that your true power, like you have this knowing that your true power doesn't reside anywhere else except for within you. You don't get that power from people outside of you. Now, ways that this can show up is if you need other people to validate who you are, like saying that you're a good parent, that you're sexy enough, that you're smart enough, that you're capable enough. You can get all this input from the outside world, which are positives. It also leaves you very open to taking in a lot of very negative input from the outside world, or even trying to kind of future predict or dive into your own uh, inner critic a little too heavily to tell you all the ways that you're not doing enough, doing it wrong. And then that can lead to a lot of negative self talk and a very high negative self view. Now, one of the spaces this came across really potently for me in my own journey was around my body image. So, for me, my body image was something that I had had struggles with since I was a very young child. I want to say the first time I remember saying something to another person about my body image and it not being good enough or that I was too fat or whatever it was. I was a normal sized little kid at that point in time. Um, but in that, it was like second or third grade. Like I already had these layers of dysmorphia because I was being told by the world around me what was a perfect body, right? And that had a lot to do with how that body looked. And so, part of my own journey in connecting to my own true power is not relying on the positive or negative things that other people say about my body, and instead coming back to how I feel in my body, recognizing how I feel about my body and trying to come to places of gratitude. And this can be hard, especially if you carry a lot of disdain for the way you physically look or the way you act or other things. I do want to make clear that having disdain or disgust for the ways our body looks is something that is very socially taught. Same thing with a lot of the things about our personality where other people may like or dislike that, right? As a baby, as a young child, like you don't have a lens that tells you there's anything wrong with your physical body. It's just the input we get from the world around us that can tell us there's something wrong with that. So being in your true power is being in your knowing, being in your reality, being in your experience, recognizing your needs, recognizing your feelings, and having that connection with yourself to move forward, to use those as points of value. So one example that I have of this, and it's my one of my bigger examples, is I always hated my stomach. And when I first started going into stepping into these practices of showing myself love, my stomach was one I avoided. One, because I had a really hard time identifying anything that I liked or was appreciative about that space in my body. And what I ended up finding was after I'd had my son, I was able to come back to appreciation and gratitude for my body and my stomach in particular, having carried this child within me, because there is a huge amount of change and shifts and literally organs getting moved around and compressed. And then when the baby's out, all of a sudden they're dropping back into place. Like it is a massive amount of change and shift in a very short period of time. And the female body is set up beautifully to manage this and move through those spaces. So I was able to connect with gratitude and appreciation there. There are other ways to do that as well, such as recognizing like that your what your intestines do for you, right? What your internal organs do for you. Maybe you don't like the way that your stomach looks on the surface, and at the same time can find other things that you're appreciative for in what it does to serve you, to allow you to live, to allow you to move throughout the world. Now we can start broadening this. This was a very physical example, right? And what I like to do is we start out a little bit more surface level, and in that realm, it is the very physical. And then we start going down into the layers, into the depths of what creates you, who you are, outside of just the very surface level and the physical. That next piece of being in your true power is a part of recognizing that like you have these different identities within you that are valuable, that were formed over time, and getting in your right relationship and right alignment with them. So, what do I mean by right relationship and right alignment? A lot of the times when we don't like something about ourselves, whether that is something about our physical body, something about the way we act or behave, something about the way emotions come up, we end up thinking we need to get rid of these things, that we need to like eject them from our system so they're no longer a part of us and they just need to change and go away. Well, that is an option. And one thing I have personally found is that the phrase of what you resist persists. And it has rung so true for me on so many levels. When I bring it back to the physical body, when I had this huge disdain of my stomach, right, as that very like physical appearance of it, the way it looked, all these things, in that I would try to do exercises, try to do all these things to like get my stomach to change. And it never really did. Or when it did, I didn't even recognize it because I was so focused on not wanting it to be what it was. Well, in that, one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating was the more I showed my stomach love, the more I showed my belly love, whether that was literally giving it like physical touch or saying words of gratitude to it in the mirror, words of appreciation about how it was functioning for me in my life, it shifted my body. It shifted the way I was present in my body. And weirdly, when I started looking in the mirror, I started seeing something that I enjoyed and I liked rather than something that disgusted me. And I actually, at this point in time, I had stopped weighing myself because I'd gotten over the idea that your weight really means much of anything. One of my favorite authors, I believe it's from the book um, Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. She has a whole chapter in there about women's body and their weight. And the quote from the book that I absolutely love is, "You want to know a way to lose like 10 or 20 pounds like that?" And the answer is cut off a limb. It's really not about weight. And it's accurate. There are many ways you can lose weight really, really quickly. And it's not actually about the weight, right? It's about how you feel in your body. It's about your health and happiness being in your body. And oddly, the more you focus on your health and happiness, doing things you enjoy doing in your body, in being in your body, the more it creates this feedback loop to where your body starts shifting and forming into this form that you really love. And it's this, again, it's kind of like the secret, right? Or the law of manifestation. Like you you be what you want to be before you actually have that thing, and then it comes very naturally. But I've seen this in action many times, not only through my own body image journey, but also in creating relationships. The more I was focused on finding the right Dom or finding the right romantic partner and all these other things, the more pressure I was putting on it having to be this one thing versus creating the space for myself where I already feel like I have that thing. I can easily recognize what it is when it comes in rather than focusing on all the things I don't want to be experiencing. And then it comes in. So I know I said a lot in a very short span right there. Um, One way I highly recommend in creating this reality and creating this sovereign dom within you, and in that sovereignty it's being your own best leader, is start noticing how you talk about the things you want in your life. A lot of the time we end up talking about all the things we don't want to be experiencing, which is great, though knowing what the red flags are amazing. And if you only have an image of what the red flags are and you don't know what the green flags would look like or what they look like for you, then how do you know that you even have that thing when it does come around? So, one way I use this tool is I will actually listen to all the things I don't want. And you can grab a piece of paper, write all these things out. Like, if you notice your mind is focused on, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want to feel heartbreak again, I don't want to go through toxic or abusive relationships again. Those are all great to know. You can then take each of those points and ask yourself, okay, if I wasn't experiencing heartbreak again, what would I have instead? If I wasn't experiencing toxic relationships again, what would I have instead? If I wasn't experiencing body shame, body hate, what would I have instead? And then you start getting a clear image of what that looks like for you. Because what all of us want out of relationships, there can be bigger, broader things that are similar in character. And we each are our own unique individuals and unique beings. And we have different things that we desire to experience from relationships, from our body, from work, from DS dynamics, from whatever that is. That's going to bring us into our next point of one of the top things that I find as a really high attribute in being your own best Dom. And that's realizing that vulnerability is not equal to weakness. Vulnerability is actually a huge strength. And a lot of the time in our society, and especially gets touted towards men, but can also be carried over towards females as well, is that emotions are a weakness, right? Or being scared is a weakness. Um, I personally had some experiences in my past where I didn't realize it necessarily at the time, but looking back, it's like, oh, that was actually a really scary situation or a really dangerous situation for what was going on in the world around me. And I took actions in those situations that like I actually carried shame around. That's one of the bigger ones is my system just going into a freeze response. And a freeze response, you can think about a possum playing dead, being immobile, just being stuck and frozen where you're at. And I I remember feeling a lot of shame around these things because like one of them was I was in a earthquake when I was a young child. And like my mom was yelling at me from the hall. I stayed in my bed and like my system just went, nope, go back to sleep, curl up against the wall. And all these things happened in this perfect order to me, not even realizing it. Where if I had not moved, so rolled over against the wall, which I never did, I would have been crushed by an armoire that was placed across from my bed in my bedroom. If I'd been out in the hallway with my mom when this earthquake had hit, there was an iron that had fallen out of an upper cabinet. There was a bathroom connected to that hallway with a large glass mirror that happened to shatter and explode out into the hallway. There was a set of bookshelves in her bedroom that exploded out into the hallway as well. So, weirdly, it was much more likely that I would have been injured or worse if I had actually listened to what my mom was telling me at the time, which was to get out into the hallway, which was also like an agreed upon action plan. But something in my system knew that the direction it gave me of roll over next to the wall, go back to sleep, was the best option for me at the time. And I can't explain that besides it was my own intuition. And I'm really glad that as a young child, I followed that because otherwise I may not be here today. Or I may have suffered some pretty severe injuries in that experience. Um, and that's one of the important pieces for me in our emotions as well is our emotions which have been seen as a vulnerability and taught as a vulnerability for a really long time in our history actually are very deeply connected with our intuition and with our inner knowing. And so the more we end up muting those out, so let's say anger or sadness, right? Anger or crying was something that you learned was not safe for you to do, that it was a weakness and something that you shouldn't do. What ends up happening is the sensations that give you that signal in your body get kind of dulled out and numbed out because you learn to not listen to them. Well, those same sets of sensations are actually linked to other emotions like joy and happiness, love, safety. And you can actually start to become more removed from feeling those things in your body as well. It also averts us from being able to recognize those red flags or the warning signs earlier on because we kind of brush them aside and say, oh, well, I'm just being crazy. It doesn't really matter. I'm just being emotional. I'm being too sensitive, whatever it is. I'm not saying like if you feel super angry to go and scream and yell your head off at somebody or punch them or worse. What I'm saying is to learn how to recognize your emotions on a lower level because your emotions are trying to communicate something very important to you about your experience, about the way you're enjoying your experience or not enjoying your experience, and what the needs are underneath. And that for me, that was a really big part of my personal journey was getting in that right relationship with my emotions. And it's still not always there. There is a default part of me because it was conditioned in so young that will tell me like it's not safe to like, feel angry. It's not safe to cry. I do also want to give a side note here. Even things that most people would identify as positive emotions can be unsafe at times. So let's say you went through a really chaotic breakup at the end of a dating relationship or marriage. And that was the one space that you really felt loved, that you really felt seen, that you really felt heard. Well, part of your system can end up getting the message that it's not safe to experience love. It's not safe to be loved. And on a very unconscious level, it'll start taking actions to prevent you from seeing where you receive that in the world, to push you away from other relationships that could help fulfill that, even though that one relationship wasn't able to. But the more you come into being able to be mindful with your emotions, sit down with them, hear what they have to say, see, because sometimes it comes through as images of memories of what's come up that's been similar to this in the past, then you can start to build this line of communication. And most of us think of communication needing to happen with another person, with another being, um, communicating with your dog, right? So, with your dog or your cat. But we also communicate with ourselves on a very regular basis. This can be in self talk. So, start noticing, how do you talk to yourself throughout the day? Like, are you your own worst critic? Are you super judgmental or harsh with yourself? Are you your own biggest cheerleader? Are you the person who's getting curious about what you're experiencing and willing to notice and hold yourself in those spaces? And to me, that later piece, the latter piece, comes back to what it means to be your own best dom. It means that like you've got you and you know you've got you. It comes back to being in this deep reverence for self and continuing to come back to self love, self compassion, and kindness. Realizing that even though you may be an adult, you may have had 100 relationships or just a few, but were really long relationships with other people, with romantic partners, however you want to define relationships. In those spaces, like you've always got you. No matter what happens, you can trust yourself to make the best choices, to keep yourself safe, to come back to self love, to come back to self compassion. Now, one thing I noticed in my system is My I went through some toxic relationships, some very, very toxic relationships that involved a lot of emotional and mental abuse. One of them that involved physical abuse. Thankfully, that was not continued. It was a one-time instance. And like, I wanted to give the person the benefit of the doubt. He definitely needed help. I was not the person who needed to be there to fix him. In that, for me subjecting myself to some of the spaces I did, one of the things I've realized through my self work is in listening to my inner critic, like just sitting there and observing it. As much abuse as I subjected myself to in those relationships, my own inner critic was easily 10 times worse for the way she would talk to me about me, tell me what I was doing, what I was experiencing, dismiss what I was feeling, all the things. Now we can also use the inner critic as a tool rather than having to identify it. The problem is a lot of the time we learn to identify with it because it's those voices of people in our past telling us you weren't good enough, you didn't deserve this, you're not worthy, you're unlovable, whatever it may be. It can also come back to I statements. And regardless of if it's coming from an outside source or an internal source, we end up internalizing that to be about who we are as a whole person. Now, the interesting thing about this is any of us have the capability to be anything. And getting into the realms of duality, like if you are undeserving of love, you are also the exact opposite of that. So, absolutely deserving of love. If you are completely unworthy, you are also completely worthy. Right? And it's a fun mind fuck I like to play with myself, but the sooner I can recognize that it's sort of like a game, the easier it is to play with and take a step back. So I don't have to identify as only being that thing. Because believe me, if I only believed I was those things that my inner critic said I was, I would probably go dig a hole and just lay at the bottom of it because I wouldn't want to do anything else because nothing I did would be good enough ever. I wouldn't be here recording this call. I wouldn't have done any of the self work I've done. I literally just would have gone and become a pile of mush at the bottom of a big pit that I dug for myself. The thing is, these emotions can be deep, these emotions can be so heavy and weighty at times. So if you do not feel competent, you do not feel like you have the right tools to be able to get yourself into that right alignment, into that right relationship with your emotions for yourself, then I really highly recommend seeking out help from a professional, whether that's a therapist, whether that's a counselor, whether that's a coach, or some other guide or mentor. One thing that we can tend to revert back to a lot of the time is going to family and friends. Family and friends can be a very helpful place. It can also be one of the spaces where a lot of our trauma was created. And you get other people who are very much so in their own patterns, their own inner critic, their own ways to stay safe in the world. And they'll just tell you what to do. Unsolicited advice is something that people really, really love to give, right? And that can create unsafety on its own because that falls into you being out of your true power. When you're in your true power, you get to recognize that you have a choice in how you're moving forward. In certain relationships that revolve around unsolicited advice, you end up finding yourself in spaces where people tell you what they believe you should do, which can be based off of their experiences and are completely valid, but it may not be the right choice for you. You are the only person who can decide. And so that brings us back to like when you're able to be with your own vulnerability, right? You're able to come back to your own choice and you're in your true power. Because in your true power, you are the only person actually controlling you, right? And if you allow that space to open up to bringing in a Dom, bringing in a partner who also makes choices in that space, it's because you're delegating a level of responsibility. You're saying, I trust you to make these choices based on your experience. It's not just something that is based on obligation, it is a trust, it is formed through a relationship. Now, how do we start building out trust and creating those spaces of safety when we're in relationships with other people? Now, this comes back to our third bigger point here, and that is being able to recognize your own limits and boundaries. So, in the world of BDSM and kink, your boundaries are typically referred to around kinky play as your limits, and these can be soft limits or these can be hard limits. There is a prior episode on this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on the difference of hard and soft limits. But if you're interested in learning more and getting to discover a little bit more about what that means for you, then I definitely recommend going and checking it out. But this can also come over into the space of boundaries. And there can be times that we don't want to feel like we have boundaries between us and other people, or maybe we weren't given the proper tools to know how to create healthy boundaries. Now, a healthy boundary is not overly rigid and it's not overly weak. It has an amount of flexibility to it. And like it comes back to being an easy no if it's a no for you. And one reason I like to bring in the idea of limits and those being very equivalent to boundaries is because I had a really hard time identifying what my boundaries were. But when it came to the world of BDSM and kink, when I like looked at what sorts of or types of play would I be a hard no to, it's just that's never going to happen. That was easy for me to define out. When it came to what are those like maybes or it's a kind of no, those are my soft limits. Those I typically needed more information about or to research about, have conversations, and understand what my partner was wanting to decide if I wanted to explore that. But it was never something that like needed to get pushed. And if it got pushed up against, then it was an easy no to recognize this is just not for me and I can step away. Now, it could be the reverse for you. You may have an easy time with boundaries in other areas of your life. And when it comes to kink and BDSM, you're like, I have no idea. And that is perfectly okay too. One of the things I've realized through my own personal work and working with others is maybe they have great boundaries when it comes to their work and terrible when it comes to their partnered relationships, or great boundaries when it comes to their like extended family who they no longer live with, but terrible boundaries with their kids. Just because we have good boundaries in one area doesn't necessarily mean we have great boundaries in other areas. And the reverse is true. Just because we have terrible boundaries in one area doesn't necessarily mean we have terrible boundaries in all areas. So, starting to recognize what those are for you, where you know what your boundaries are. So, let's say this comes back to your job, right? And you work full time for an employer. Are you willing to work more than 40 hours a week? Like, is it a hard limit for you? Is it a boundary for you that, like, you're just not willing to work more than 40 hours a week because your time outside of work is more valuable? And there's no right or wrong if you're willing to work 60 or 80 hours a week. Cool. Just know that for yourself and know how to tell when it's becoming too much and you need to take a step back, or know when you like feel like you have a little bit more flexible room and you can take more of a step into that, right? It's there concepts and policies that like you can apply to just kink and BDSM relationships, but also carry over incredibly well into the rest of your life, where you can start showing up as this leader, where you can start showing up in your true power, knowing that you don't actually have control over anyone else. And the biggest person you do have control over, which comes down to your choices, is yourself. One thing I guess I want to go back to, because it is an area where people can feel a big lack of control, is when it comes to our emotions. And especially when it comes to emotions that feel really big and overwhelming. Um, One thing I want to say here is that you don't actually have control over your emotions. You can create shifts, you can create openness and awareness. Your emotions come from a very deep place within your body that is very associated with your primal being, again, with your intuition, with your animal body that is trying to deliver messages to you. And so we can get caught up in the idea that like our emotions are us and there's something we need to control. Like, I recommend control them on the level of feeling like you can make a choice of how you respond rather than reacting in situations. But a lot of the time, when emotions get to the point of being this very big, overwhelming thing in our lives, it's because we've been neglecting listening to them. And it may just be around whatever the circumstances that's coming up. It can also be compiled. So let's say you had a narrative that said that crying was a weakness, that crying was not safe, and you pushed that down for maybe decades. Well, when the proverbial faucet on your tears finally opens, a lot of the time you'll actually be getting hit with waves of all those emotions, for sadness, for crying, that you would have felt in the past that are now finally releasing out of your system. That's where a lot of somatics work can be really valuable, and going through um, conscious practices around bringing presence to your emotions. And that can be, again, bringing up positive or negative emotions within your system to be able to play with that space. If you're interested in learning more about this, I really recommend going to my resource link down below or in the about section. And there is a email sign up list called the Sovereign Dom email list, or SD email list. And you're going, if you go and sign up for that, it is completely free. There is, I believe, a 5 email sequence that goes over talking about anger in particular, but you can substitute anger for any emotion. You could substitute that with jealousy, you could substitute it with sadness, you could substitute it with joy, you could substitute it with disgust, right? But it goes out detailing like how this impacts your physical body when you're not, like when it's out of balance, whether that is the big over the top expressions that feel that are more reactionary versus being a response, or where you're pushing that down, not allowing yourself to feel and connect with it, It also talks about how it impacts your relationships. There is a completely free guided practice, which is one of my absolute favorites for helping you start to tap in with your emotions, realize that you can bring this amazing presence to them and be completely safe in doing that and giving them this outlet to finally be heard. And then an offering of joining me in work if you need more guidance. But again, there is no obligation. It is completely free for you to tap into this as a resource. And it is it is a brain dump of the knowledge I have accumulated around what comes up around repressing emotions and again continuing to see them as a weakness rather than this incredibly valuable tool. So coming back to boundaries, because that was a little bit of a tangent, one spot, and I know this was a sticky spot for me when it came to understanding my limits and boundaries. I had this idea for whatever reason. Keep in mind, I had terrible teaching around what healthy boundaries were when I was a child, but I noticed through my own work, I had this pattern of I could actually express what my boundaries were to another person. I could say, hey, like, I really don't like it when you leave your dirty dishes piling up in the sink. Or um, I think there's a whole bunch of different things that could come into play here as far as things that I didn't enjoy. Hey, like, I don't want you borrowing my shirts because when they get returned, they have holes in them, they have stains on them now, or they're stretched out, whatever that may be. Right? These are different examples of where I have expressed boundaries at certain points in life. Well, in my understanding of boundaries, or at least what I knew of them before, I thought that just telling somebody what my boundaries were was enough. And what I kept finding as this pattern that repeated over and over again is I could express these things, and the other person, whether it wasn't they didn't listen, they didn't care, their own needs mattered more to them, whatever it was, they would just go on and continue to do the thing. So, one great example, and trigger warning, I guess, um, it is an example of abuse, but I would have an ex partner after we split up regularly decide to call me names such as bitch, cunt, um, or other things when he got angry. And I expressed to him several times, is like, hey, like, I'm happy to talk to you. I don't want to stay in this conversation if you're going to choose to call me these names. And he would keep doing it. The thing I didn't get was I thought that me stating my boundary was enough. That because I told somebody that I didn't like this thing, that meant that they would stop. Well, in caring relationships, that is true. Like somebody cares about you, they're going to respect your boundaries. That's them showing action, that's them showing compassion, care, kindness for who you are as an individual. The thing I didn't realize was the person ultimately responsible for my boundaries was me. And that meant that when I told somebody that I didn't like an action, like being called names when they were angry, that they just got to keep doing it. And I stayed in the conversation and they just kept doing that thing. I didn't actually understand at that point that it was on me taking an action for my own boundary. So I don't want to be in this conversation with a person who's name calling. I hang up the phone. I stop checking my text messages. I leave the room. I create distance and space for myself because that is kind and compassionate to myself. It also potentially is incredibly kind and compassionate to this other person as well. I actually had seen it at some point in time if I walked away from that situation that I was being neglectful or abandoning or doing something to hurt this person. And what I realized was when I stayed in that sort of engagement, and the more my system got triggered that this isn't okay, like, I don't want to be treated like this, but I'm staying here, the more likely I was to engage in the way that they were engaging, right? So I might be more likely to revert to name calling or blaming or shaming them in trying to defend myself, which again is also valid. That's me going into a fight response. It wasn't the way that I wanted to respond. And it took me a little while to recognize that. So, in those situations, it was how do I create the space for myself? Knowing that when I tell somebody a boundary, what is the consequence? What is the action I'm willing to take if this continues for myself and for them? Because ultimately, if I'm getting into engaging further and going down this spiral of conversation that is devolving very quickly into very abusive and toxic realms, that's not necessarily healthy for either of us. And again, I was happy to have those conversations. I just didn't want to be name called. Also valid. And it didn't mean that they needed to be calling me names to get their point across. Granted, I don't know if that person had tools otherwise to know how to communicate those things. And honestly, like, as far as the tools they were taught, that's no fault of their own. Where their own ownership and accountability comes in is they're being told, hey, this doesn't work for me by another person. Like, can we try approaching this a different way? If they're not willing to change, they're not willing to change. And there's nothing I can do about that. Again, I don't actually have control over that other person. The one person I have control over is me. And again, that brings me back to being in my power. So, what I ended up deciding or connecting with eventually was people can get really intimidated by boundaries. I was really intimidated by boundaries, especially when I came up against people who were very confrontational about another person having boundaries because it didn't align with what they were wanting. And I was constantly feeling like I would put up a wall, I would put up this boundary, and then they'd come in and just bulldoze it over, and then I'd put up the wall, and it was exhausting. Well, that told me I needed to create more space for myself. And then the next time it happened, it was more space for myself until I get to the point of, okay, like I feel like we have enough distance that my boundaries are being respected. And sometimes that starts getting closer again and that bulldozer keeps coming in. And I get a nice reminder that I need to take a step back. And that's okay. Again, that is me being kind and compassionate and loving to myself and to this other person. So we don't go into this nasty spiral of a space together. Um, but ultimately, that's boundaries are one of the top forms of self love. And in telling, like, you never have to actually tell another person your boundaries. Being willing to tell another person your boundaries can be very kind, and it can actually give them a roadmap of how to love you back, right? Because if somebody else is willing to respect your boundaries, respect your autonomy, and in you being a unique person, then it is more indicative that they're showing a level of caring, right? They're showing a level of trust that you can make your own choices and that you can be your own person. And that's for me, I want everybody to be their own person. I don't want to like you because you're trying to be somebody I think you should be or who you think I think you should be, right? I want to love you because you're you. But that also means that I get to love me because I'm me and have that space. I get to be my own best leader. And sometimes, as a submissive, I invite you in to this space and say, here, you make the choices for a little while, right? You've shown me that you can keep me safe, which is through action, not just through words. And now we can move forward. And again, kind of that concept of the secret and the laws of manifestation, the more you start giving that to yourself, the more you will actually recognize when other people are showing up in those ways for your relationships. And when they're not, that's just a really good sign that you and that person are not in a great alignment to be in a relationship together. It may just be you're at two different places. It doesn't mean that either place is better or worse. It just means that it's not that right alignment. Now, one thing I do want to invite everyone to, and I didn't really get into it too much, but is to look at this concept of not only being your own best dom, but in the capability of being anything and everything. And bringing it back to your inner critic, we can also very much so be our own best sadist and our own best masochist. And this concept comes from the work, I can't remember the author's name, but it's a book called Existential Kink. And it is phenomenal. The author is hilarious, but she actually talks really deeply on this concept and applies the idea of being your own best sadist and your own best masochist to shadow work. And it is a phenomenal tool in learning how to play with those darker sides of yourself, the identities, the aspects of yourself that you reject, how to start recognizing those in the world and using the world as a reflection so you can see what you have to work with. Again, to find that right alignment and right relationship within yourself for you. And it is one of the most valuable tools I have come across in creating ways to actually play with the shadow, to play with shadow work. Because again, the shadow work is usually those dark, big, heavy things that most of us don't even want to take a look at. So if you can find ways to play in that proverbial cave of yourself, to play in the dark forest, right? To play in the depths of the ocean, however you want to best define that for yourself or identify with it, then really go check it out because it is such a worthwhile adventure. And again, if you need guidance, find somebody who can guide you. I really, really recommend working with somebody who is at least trauma informed, if not trauma trained. Um, Not all therapists are actually trauma trained through their standard education. It is typically an additional training process that they have to go through after the fact. I can say I have not met a single person who does not have some form of trauma in their life. We all have our traumas, we all have our wounds, and that can be the big things like having gone through sexual assault. It can be that we have been through war, right? It can be that we went through extreme physical abuse as a child in our home or many other things, right? that are the big glaring ones. Trauma can also be on more minute levels. Again, the idea that your anger isn't safe, your sadness isn't safe, your love isn't safe. Like those are traumas of their own. And that is where I recommend working with somebody who is trained and at least has an awareness around working with trauma and when to refer out um, to somebody who may be a little bit more capable of holding them in that space if they need to. And that's just so we're helping minimize creating more trauma, right? Or this idea of like being a people pleaser, like that comes from traumatic relationships and the narratives we tell ourselves. It's the ways we tell ourselves that we stay safe, the ways we need to be or should act or can't be to stay safe in the world. And it holds us back from being that authentic expression of ourselves. It holds us back from being able to deeply connect with our intuition. It holds us back from being able to have all those things we desire and are completely worthy of having. So it's a recommendation. If it's something you'd like to explore with me, I am happy to guide those spaces. And again, you can find a link down below or in the About section under my resource tab, and you can book a free discovery call. We can talk about what you having coming up, where you want to go, and see if we're a good match for working together through coaching. And if we're not, I am happy to recommend other resources that may serve you better. I am not the best coach for everyone, but hopefully you got some value out of this space today. And that is my question for you. What is your big takeaway from this concept and idea of being your own best dom? What's one thing you will take with you moving forward after having listened to this? And comment that down below. Share. Like, get curious about what that is for you because each time you get curious about you, you learn a little bit more about who you are, what you want to create, and what you desire to be and experience within the world. All right, until next time, have a phenomenal week, and I will see you next Thursday.